Welcome to the first video on P.D. James's 1972 novel, An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. This is another video in the series Greenwich Detection Fiction, created for the third year core course in English Literature at the University of Greenwich. Now, before we go any further, I need to give you a couple of warnings. First, there are spoilers ahead. So if you have finished the novel, I suggest you do so now before progressing any further at all. Stop this video. Don't even wait for the next slide. My second warning is about the novel itself. I can't speak for you, but I find this the most disturbing of all the texts we study on this course. There are a couple of murders, so far so standard, but one of those murders, I did warn you to stop if you haven't finished the novel, is the murder of a son by a father. And then there are the two suicides that bracket the novel, one at the beginning, very much on stage, which I find horrendous to read, and one at the end, off stage. In addition, one of the murders is set up to look like a suicide. We have two deaths in car accidents, which, well, you know me by now, is deliberately meant to recall both the train accident in Henry Dunbar, where the traveller doesn't die, though we expect him to. There is the boat problem, though, isn't there, where there is a death. And of course, the end of the previous novel in this series, Raymond Chandler's Lady in the Lake, when DeGarmo's car goes over the cliff, just as one of the cars in the fatal car accidents in this novel goes over a cliff too. Now, then we have quite a lot of sexual experimentation and cross-dressing, faked and real. Well, this was published in the early 1970s, and the swinging 60s was still swinging strong. Yeah, pause for a second. Faked sexual experimentation and cross-dressing, which suggests to me powerfully an exploration of gender as a masquerade. But then we also find pervasive stereotypes about class and gender that not all students pick up, but which most certainly are there to be read if you can read the clues. Even less obvious is the terrible childhood neglect that joins two of the central characters. I don't know why students don't get that. It's very, very obvious to me. Parents are serious failures in this novel, especially fathers. And finally, and this is about this video rather than the novel, you'll come across quite appalling, if incidental, racism later on, when I come to discuss the relationship of An Unsuitable Job for a Woman to the 1930s golden age of detective fiction. Now, if you find any of this disturbing, and I do, then maybe this and the subsequent videos on this novel are not for you. Maybe it's time to move on and omit these videos. I won't stop because I feel we have to face things we don't like that make us uncomfortable, when it comes to narrative anyway. If we just ignore them, they won't go away. We need to face them and find a way to learn from what we don't like. It's just the same as when I refuse to laugh at Henry Mansell's denunciation of sensation fiction, like most critics do, and instead I treat him seriously even while disagreeing with the basis of his argument, and I always will disagree with him. We need to think about what we can learn from what we disagree with. Disagreement with something or finding it disturbing doesn't mean we should dismiss or destroy it. We may disagree, but to deal with our disturbance, we must dialogue. As always, underlying my whole argument is a consideration of this slide. You saw it first in the very first video on Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue. In this video on An Unsuitable Job, we'll be thinking about how the text allows readers to play the game it offers by activating various archives through the laying down of clues in a specific order over the time of reading. But you remember that time doesn't only mean the sequence of words on the page. the sequence of units of reading. It doesn't mean form alone. It also refers to historical context. Detection, too, doesn't mean agreeing to play the game that the text obviously offers us. Detection also means hunting for clues about what the text depends on, but doesn't say explicitly. It means hunting for the discourses that control the text, the hidden arguments that are assumed by the text to make it seem realistic and convincing. It may be that in order to do all of that, we need to expand our archive with contextual or other knowledge. Now, I bet you're expecting me to spend this first video on an unsuitable job for a woman on gender. After all, isn't a problem with gender signalled by the very title? Well, by now you'll also know that I'm not one to go for the most obvious or simplest solutions. We shall be returning to gender in a subsequent video, but here I want to talk about class. Yes, indeed. Now, I want to do that because, in my experience, students are far less good at reading the clues of class than of gender. I've said this before in the videos, in the one on the red silk scarf, for example. Now, students, I said, have been trained to read texts critically in terms of gender already by the time they come to university, and they don't need to listen to or watch a video to see what's happening in terms of gender, at least not superficially. Of course, it's a suitable job for a woman, detection. Well, is it? Anyway, in that video, in the one on the red silk scarf, I turned to form. Here, I'm emphasizing another structure of inequality, which can at times, as I hope to show, be even more powerful than gender. I'm going to look at class starting with the author herself, P.D. James. Now you know by now too that authors are not a major concern of this set of videos. What authors meant or intended is of little interest to me. Where I've looked at authors, it's to present them as marketing phenomena in the industry of literature and publishing. You remember how carefully Mary Braddon was marketed in the mid-19th century in liberal metropolitan newspapers? Well, similarly here, I'm going to be thinking of P.D. James not as a real, breathing person with intentions and desires and what she wants us to understand, but as a brand, as a name that's subject to market segmentation, as a name with associations that are constructed by the industry. And a key part of that brand is her relationship to what you've already heard called the golden age of detective fiction in Britain of the 1920s and 50s. This novel might be published in 1972, but in many ways the marketing suggests that it's a continuation of work from much earlier. Now, let's pause for a second and think about the connection that I've made there. I've basically said that class corresponds to market segment. Well, I'm not at all claiming that this is a definitive, a final definition of class. But think of it, this is a course on literature and publishing, and this set of videos is about how we read. And how we read is dependent on what market segment we are in. We can cross market segments by means of education. We can cross class by means of education, as we'll explore later on. Previously, I've suggested that, as things stand now, capitalism and the discourses that support it are dominant, that they control relations between all our key terms and ideas. Controls not entirely, but very largely. Now, you may have heard that our class is connected to where we stand as regards our place in the means of production. That's the Marxist idea, that the working class make the goods and the middle class own the means, the tools for the working class to make the goods. As far as this section of the course is concerned, class is less concerned with what we make than with what we consume. We are defined by what cultural items, what texts we read, and how we read them. We're defined by what archives we can draw on. We're defined by what manner we can play the games of reading in. Whether, what and how we read suspiciously, like detectives. Now, in order to play the game at all, at least legally, we have to buy text in some form. We have to act as consumers. Our choices and activities in that regard, whether we like it or not, mark us out, therefore, as members of market segments. Of course, there's nothing stopping us from belonging to more than one segment, either at various times or even at the same time. And maybe one point in our lives we'll belong to one market segment, and then maybe very soon we'll belong to another. We must remember that market segments are not fixed. Neither is class. Now, authors, as I've written elsewhere, are brands. Authors' names promise the same kinds of experience. If you've read one P.D. James, you'll love her next. Authors' names act as guarantors of quality, at least in theory. Authors' names are a promise of quality. Some promises appeal to some social segments, some classes, and other promises to other segments, other classes. Raymond Chandler's promise of hardboiled detective fiction is different from P.D. James's promise, isn't it? And P.D. James's promise, as we'll see, is quite largely built on her relation to the golden age of detective fiction of Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Ngaio Marsh, and Marjorie Allingham. Perhaps confusingly, though, the P.D. James brand, which is a constructed image, I need to repeat that. P.D. James' brand is nothing to do with the real person. Well, nothing, very little. The brand also mobilizes P.D. James's life. It mobilizes her body in ways that we haven't seen before. Yes, images and interviews with Conan Doyle and Raymond Chandler, and even Mary Braddon were used to promote their work, but by no means on the scale of P.D. James. It's fitting, therefore, to start with a typical publicity image of her. I love this publicity photo by Rex, taken at P.D. James's home in Holland Park in 2011. She may have been 91 when this photograph was taken, but you have to admire that steely gaze. She looks right at you. She sees you. She sees who you really are. There's no hiding from her. She is very formidable indeed. She's suspicious. She's not fearful. She sees the truth. Then look at the tasteful beads. The expensive, very simple top. Is it cashmere? The carefully coiffed hair, which is not so severely held in place by lotions and potions that little untidiness is not allowed, for this is a woman who focuses on her profession, on her writing, on seeing and communicating the truth, not on her appearance. Ha! Admire the excellent, unflashy paintwork of what may be a hefty, good quality door frame. That's not been picked up from B&Q in the bargain sale, I can tell you. And then the wedding ring, the only ring we can see on her fingers, indeed the only jewellery she wears apart from the necklace, which so charmingly and discreetly unites the colours of her hair with the doorway. An elegant, moneyed Miss Marple, perhaps? Perhaps indeed. Are we in doubt that this is a solidly middle-class, successful writer who will appeal to the successful middle classes, or those who have an image of themselves as successful middle classes? Perhaps she'll appeal especially to successful middle-class women, but not only. It's not gender that's dominant here. Replace the woman with a man's. Would it still work? Yes, the clothes might change, but not the dominant message, the steely gaze that sees the core of who you are. Yet imagine the same body without the discreet trappings of wealth, with decades of bad diet, no education, experience of power, no hairstylist, no contacts who can take such an elegantly lit photograph. No, this photograph is gendered, of course, but its power derives from the signs of class. As you know, life stories of authors are not usually of interest on this course. However much I might enjoy reading biographies of the authors, I don't usually teach them, except in snatches. But here, all together as a set of notes, is an entire life. Terrible that we can reduce someone to just one page, isn't it? And yet this life, as I've said, is P.D. James, the brand. This information is very easy to find out all over the internet. I have, of course, reduced it even further than what you can find. I've selected those elements that I think may resonate perhaps most powerfully with an unsuitable job for a woman. I leave you to make those connections, though. I'm not going to make them myself. Phyllis had to leave school at the age of 16 to work because even though her father was a decently paid tax inspector and decidedly middle class, her family didn't have much money because of the additional costs of not having a mother at home. Remember, these were the days before labour-saving devices and certainly before the National Health. And if you had no one at home to do the washing, you had to buy in help if you were to go out to work in a clean shirt and suit. Another key reason that Phyllis didn't continue in school at a time when few women went to university anyway was that her father didn't believe in higher education for girls. So she went out to work in 1936. And while she was working in a box office at Cambridge in 1941, she met Ernest Connor Bantry White, a trainee doctor. That's just 2 years before The Lady in the Lake was published. The couple married quickly, as they did during the war, and soon had 2 daughters, Claire and Jane. Ernest, when he was qualified, went off to war to India, and he returned from the war with such severe mental illness that he had to be institutionalized, like Phyllis's mother. Phyllis managed to get a job in the newly created National Health Service to support the family. She started writing detective fiction on her commute in order to earn extra pennies. She had no time to waste. She had to make even commuting work for her. Her first 2 novels came out in quick succession, Cover Her Face in 1962 and A Mind to Murder in 1963, when her eldest daughter was 21. Her detective was Adam Dalgleish, who will appear several times in this and subsequent videos. Most of the time, her husband remained in hospitals. He committed suicide by overdosing on drugs and alcohol in 1964 while he was on a visit home. 4 years after her husband's suicide, Phyllis James started working in branches of the civil service concerned with the police and crime. She retired aged 59, and only then, after having published 7 novels, did she turn to writing as a full-time occupation. As you can see from the screen, 14 of her 19 novels centre on her police detective hero, Chief Inspector and later Commander Adam Dalgleish, the character that James is most often associated with. There are just 2 Cordelia Gray novels, and in both of those, Adam Dalgleish appears as well. Almost all of the Adam Dalgleish novels have been adapted as serials for TV, starting in the early 1980s. Only the last 2 haven't been. And of the 2 Cordelia Gray novels, only the first one's been filmed with anything like fidelity in 1982, and even then there are distinct licenses taken. There are also two 1990s ITV series based on James's two Cordelia Gray novels. The second one is called The Skull Beneath the Skin. In these versions, Cordelia has a sidekick, a benign Miss Sparshot, very different from the original. I can see the dramatic usefulness of having a sidekick, but really it completely undermines the function of Miss Sparshot in the novel, more of which maybe next video. Now, back for the last time to James's life. As I said, it was after her retirement in the 1980s that James became a full-time writer. That's when the television serials start. Of course, those television serials worked synergistically. The industry was delighted. The television serials boosted the popularity of P.D. James's novels enormously, and when she died in 2014, she'd amassed a personal fortune of some £22 million. And look, already having received an OBE in 1983, in the New Year's Honours List of 1991, the only person to be so raised on that occasion, she became a life peer in the House of Lords on the Conservative side. Baroness of Holland Park. Holland Park referring to where she lived in London, in a rather gorgeous house on Holland Park Avenue, which now sports a blue plaque to her, which she'd bought in 1984, just at the beginning of her superstardom. She also had, by the way, houses in Oxford and in Southwold, a seaside town in Suffolk. P.D. James, then, this is part of the brand, had a tough life. The mental illness of her husband and mother, the suicide of her husband, the way she had to make her own way. What we see, of course, in the story is that James won through. She worked hard and maintained her middle-class position, even improved it. She educated herself, she educated her daughters, she looked after herself and after her family. A tough life, but she's tough enough to overcome it. P.D. James knows life and has won life's game, even with the bad hand that life dealt her. She overcame all obstacles. I think you can start to see the brand image. P.D. James is a formidable member of the middle classes, isn't she? So formidable that she can transcend class to become a peer for her lifetime only. She becomes a decision maker in the House of Lords. The Daily Mail, of course, captures her brand image in a series of sensational bullet points when she died. P.D. James knows the darkness that lies inside our hearts, but it's clear that she's got friends and she's overcome a tough life. And she even seems to enjoy working at a day job when she doesn't need to. She's fundamentally one of us, the hard-working, resilient middle class who survives everything. Now, a key part of the traditional middle class of the end of the 20th century, which is what we're talking about here, and which still survives amongst older readers, these are notions we're talking about, is that classes' relation to the past. The established middle classes, which its name implies is a continuer of tradition, and the brand P.D. James is lavishly garnished with the signs of established and acknowledged greatness that links her to the past. The blurb of her reflections on talking about detective fiction, which we saw in the first video in the Sherlock Holmes stories, describes her as at the forefront of the genre. And the very mention of a genre, of course, suggests a tradition, a past, a history. She's not some new experimental writer that sprung out of nowhere. Her Guardian obituary in 2014 described her as a grande dame, and it's very clear about how she continues the Golden Age tradition. It even refers to how she was called the new Queen of Crime. She has inherited the mantle of the great Agatha, rather like inheriting a kingdom. And she's inherited it even more than her fellow crime writer and fellow life peer in the House of Lords, Ruth Rendell, who is a peer on the Labour side. It's part of James's brand that she continues the great English tradition of survival and overcoming life's obstacles. Now, when she comes to talk about who she was influenced by in her 1999 autobiography, she mentions 4 women writers. It's interesting that she doesn't mention Agatha Christie here. She also doesn't mention, in this particular passage anyway, Jane Austen, who she says elsewhere also influenced her. In fact, she declaimed that Emma by Jane Austen is one of the best mystery/detective novels. Apparently, P.D. James used to read Jane Austen during the Blitz as a temporary escape from the horrors of being bombed. And when she comes 10 years later to publish talking about detective fiction, she devoted an entire chapter to women detective fiction writers. 3 of them appear in the list in her autobiography, but Josephine Tay is here replaced, perhaps rather unsurprisingly, with Agatha Christie. And of course, these are all Golden Age authors, and indeed the most famous ones. No surprises here. It's no surprise either that academics like Erlene Hibley started her 1983 contribution to a special number of modern fiction studies on detective fiction with this paragraph. In good academic style, we always begin with what's known, and then we show what we're doing is new and different from what readers already know. This paragraph asserts how readers have consistently placed P.D. James' novel in what she calls the classical tradition of detective fiction, and how the critics regard P.D. James as very much a revitalizer of the Golden Age form. Even though Hubley then goes on to show how much James differs from her predecessors, and of course P.D. James does, Hubley had to admit in the end that James is offering a variation of the Golden Age formulae that adds elements of the hard-boiled. So what exactly are we talking about when we refer to this tradition that James is supposedly part of? I mean, what follows, I'm by no means cribbing from Hubley. Hubley has a very different perspective from mine. And I have to be honest, it's quite hard to give precise sources for what I'm going to say, as I'm giving you very generally established ideas, which I then respond to in my own way. As these responses and the story that I tell from the commonplaces about Golden Age detective fiction that I think are important, it's these that I want you to take away. Of course, you are going to find a very wide variety of definitions of Golden Age detective fiction. If you're watching this, you'll no doubt be aware that few terms can be pinned down absolutely, but rather should be anchored by reference who defines it. But that said, there's so much written on Golden Age detective fiction, and you actually don't need to know the debates for this course. So what you're seeing on the screen is generally agreed set of elements. I suspect you know almost all of this screen already, perhaps unconsciously, but you will know it at some level, for even if you haven't read any Golden Age detective fiction, you almost certainly will have encountered examples from the enormous number of TV and film adaptations of Golden Age detective novels. I've offered some examples from Agatha Christie to exemplify the typical setting and cast list. Obviously, the class of the cast is important, and thereby the setting. Golden Age fiction is not typically set in the slums, and it has an almost exclusively white middle-class cast. Diversity is not its strong point. The range of society and the perspective on that range is very limited. Now, that said, you will see on the screen that I refer to social and psychological realism. Now, in this context, realism means the selection of details that make readers think the events are happening in a world that's somehow familiar to them. It's, of course, you know by now, another aspect of the proximity effect. Even if you've never been on a Nile cruise, you will still have an idea of what that involves from travel adverts and articles in newspapers and magazines. You may never have met a Belgian police detective, but literary tradition and popular culture in general will give you a clue as to how, in theory, they are supposed to behave and think. You may never have met a woman who's being blackmailed by her doctor for the murder of her husband, but you are in no doubt as to why she might commit suicide. If you are in any doubt, the text will be there to tell you, it's quite normal. This realism mobilizes the full panoply of discourses to convince us that what's being narrated is possible and even likely. Now, this is quite unlike the hard-boiled detective fiction, which tends to be urban, set in big cities, is geographically spread, and also socially spread. Most of James's novels take place in claustrophobic, enclosed communities, and there are certainly detectable traces of this in An Unsuitable Job for a woman. The move from the city to the country houses, the sub-communities inside the wider communities of the university and so on. And of course, there's great attention to social and psychological realism, where class is forensically laid out for us, as if on a dissecting table. We shall come on to that, but now let's turn to what are called the 10 Commandments of detective fiction that have changed colour rather before I wanted them to. As you see from the screen, the so-called 10 Commandments were originally formulated in the late 1920s in the introduction to a volume that collected what it claimed were the best detective stories of 1928-9. The editor of the collection, Ronald Knox, was a British cleric, the son of the Bishop of Manchester, educated at Eton and Oxford, rather like Mansell then, really. He was Catholic chaplain to Oxford University until 1939, and besides writing on religion, as you'd expect, he wrote his own detective stories and edited several anthologies of them, so not like Mansell. He was thoroughly part of the social elite, nonetheless. Amongst many other friends, he counted the popular writer G.K. Chesterton, whose detective priest Father Brown you may have heard of, and he was also good friends with Harold Macmillan, who, of course, was to become British Prime Minister from 1957 to 1963. Given his connections, it's hardly a surprise that Knox should have access to people's ears. Those 10 Commandments have been reprinted again and again. Now, while Knox claimed that he derived the rules in perfectly pragmatic, evidence-based fashion from reading the stories themselves, it seems to me that Knox was also having a bit of fun here. The rules were meant to be ironic rather than iron. Nonetheless, they've still been taken very seriously, and as you'll see very soon, I will be testing them against P.T. James's An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. Now, I did warn you about unsavoury racism in this video, and you will have noticed number 5. Knox's own comment on it is curious, and I do think it's worth mentioning this. Knox distances himself from the racism here, writing that, "Why this should be so, I do not know, unless we can find a reason for it in our Western habit of assuming that the celestial empire is over-equipped in the matter of brains and under-equipped in the matter of morals." In the terms of this course, he's claiming that rule number 5 is simply a part of the imperial discourse that the West uses. The rule number 5 is nothing but a Western habit. It's not a reflection of reality. That said, today I'm sure we would have welcomed a more explicit condemnation and greater thought. Now, I'm sure that this attempt to establish rules will bring to mind Henry Mansell's condemnation of sensation fiction for its formulae, the algebraic equations that I discussed in the 5th video on Henry Dunbar and found were reframed in a copyright trial as a kaleidoscope. Of course, it can be very amusing to play the game of spot the formulae or spot the conventions, but we're talking here of Brand P.D. James. Brand whose value derives largely from its alliance to the past, and therefore I do think it's useful to see whether P.D. James is following in this tradition, whether she's following the rules or not. Let's go through them one by one. It really won't take long. Well, is the criminal mentioned early in the story? Yes! On page 25 he's mentioned, and he actually appears on page 31. Do we have any supernatural agencies in the novel? No, not at all. Do we have a secret room or a secret passage? Do we? But yes, we've got the well. It's sort of secret. That's the best we can get, otherwise, no. Do we have unknown poisons or any magical scientific instruments that have caused the murders? No! Fantastic. Do we have any Chinese people? No. Is the detective ever helped by an accident or by some unaccountable intuition? No. Absolutely not. Did the detective commit the crime? Okay, I've ticked that one, but not technically. It depends on what crime we're talking about. We'll come back to that. Is the detective, does she tell us any clues that she discovers? Yes, she's incredibly voluble. In fact, she talks, and we follow her thoughts as we go through the novel, and she's very revealing about them. Do we have a sidekick? No, we don't. We have a sidekick. We're inside Cordelia's head, so we don't need that. Do we have any twin brothers or doubles? No. Perfect. It seems then that she fits beautifully, with the exception of 9. Unsuitable Job for a Woman perfectly fits the 10 Commandments of Golden Age detective fiction. It is an example of Golden Age detective fiction, therefore, though written in 1972. It looks like P.D. James really is the inheritor of the mantle of Agatha Christie, the Queen of Crime. So far, so traditional then. But what about the commonplaces of Golden Age detective fiction you can now see on the screen? Society is not itself a source of evil or disruption. It's fundamentally conservative and complacent for the Golden Age. Think of how Miss Marple solves crime by comparing people she's known in the past. She compares individuals to types who follow certain behaviours. That is, she has a theory and seeks to fit individuals into it and solves crimes that way. The murderers are types. They're born bad, and that exonerates society. Or we can think of Inspector Poirot as well. Note too that the detective is middle class and part of the social order. The detective is an insider to this middle class social order. In this Golden Age detective is not actually like Sherlock Holmes or Philip Marlowe, who are at best marginal to respectable society. The Golden Age detectives, more like Judith Lee, the teacher of the deaf, who's very much part of society and contributes to it beyond her detective work. Or perhaps like the bank clerk, Clement Austin, who's also part of society. Not like Margaret, who is marginal. Then we have the detective must not be mentally diseased or deviant, so these attributes belong to the criminal. But that wouldn't apply to Marlowe with any certainty. There are certainly clues to mental instability and non-heteronormative, non-hegemonic sexual desires if we care to read them in ways that it's hard to do with Golden Age detective fictions. Chandler opens us up to that possibility. I think it's very difficult to do that with Agatha Christie. And it's when we start thinking about these that an unsuitable job for a woman's connections to the golden age really begin to unravel. First, what are the effects of Cordelia's resolution of the mystery? Are we sure order is restored? Well, not immediately. As a result of Cordelia's interventions, a mother kills the father of her child. The mother probably commits suicide by driving off a cliff. Remember the echoes of Degamo? The detective herself lies in court, and then at the very end of the novel, it looks like she's turning to seedy, prurient sexual spying work that sounds even seedier than Marlowe looking for Crystal Kingsley. It's the kind, in fact, that Marlowe says he won't take. And then, this is often missed in my reading of the critics, the funding of the research carried out by Ronald Callender on environmental concerns dries up. Not very good results, are they? If this restoration of social order is pretty grim social order, but then perhaps this is only a small element of society and not the whole social order. Perhaps we get to compare these particular personal, or are they just personal? I'm not sure they are. These smaller elements, perhaps, with the whole. And that comes in with Adam Dalgliesh at the end. Sometimes I wonder if we're supposed to read the whole novel through the 4 words that Adam Dalgliesh utters on page 204 of my edition. Pride took his revenge. Now, these words are worth unpacking at some length, and we shall certainly return to them in a subsequent video. But for now, let's just agree that society that has been restored is pretty grim. Then there's the question of whether the detective is an insider to the middle-class society they're investigating. Well, in the first couple of pages, we find that Cordelia has a pretty squalid life. She has to work for money. Like Marlowe, she's a worker. The office she takes over from Bernie Pride is shabby. She's very little money indeed, and her living conditions are grim. She has a bedsit at her employer's home, which, based on the problems she has on the Bakerloo line in the first sentence of the novel, is probably located around Elephant and Castle, where there was still heavy bomb damage in the late 1960s, though the area, it's true, was being redeveloped. It was not a middle-class area at all, though. Then, when Cordelia's on the case, she basically becomes a squatter in a house that's falling apart, where the plaster's fallen down from the ceiling in one bedroom. There's no electricity, there's only cold water, the outside toilet has only one roll of toilet paper, for what's mainly used is soft waste paper wrapping for food. In many ways, she seems to take it all in her stride, as if she's used to poverty. Is Cordelia working class then? A lot of students think she is. No. Well, how come no? How come but? She's a worker. She's poor. Yes, those are traditional markers of class. But remember that class, in terms of this video, doesn't only derive from income, from what we produce. Class is also indicated by what we consume and by the cultural signs. This is new. The cultural signs that we transmit. There are many signs of Cordelia's middle-class position from the first page onwards. But let's have some very brief examples. Let's see how she declares her class position to the decidedly middle-class Miss Leeming when they first meet. Of course, Cordelia's accent would have helped establish her position with Miss Leeming, though that's not actually mentioned. What is a clincher here is Cordelia's cultural consumption habits. As she explains to Miss Leeming, I've got Hardy's Trumpet Major. I always have a paperback in my bag. Her reading of Thomas Hardy's only historical novel, originally published in 1880, sets up Cordelia as a literary sleuth. But unlike Marlowe, she doesn't hide it. On the contrary, she actively uses her literary knowledge to unlock the mystery. And you remember, Miss Leeming is an English literature graduate, at a time, of course, when there were very few women graduates of any kind. The next day, Cordelia is in Cambridge. Where does she go to first? Well, of course she goes to a bookshop, Bows and Bows. Not just any old bookshop, but reputedly the oldest bookshop in the country. The building is now, I should say, occupied by Cambridge University Press, and Bows and Bows no longer exists. But she buys there the cheapest guidebooks she can find. Is she tempted by perfumes like Gilla Lane Regal? Not at all. She has to resist the temptation to browse amongst the second-hand books, instead opting for the sensible option of lunch. She knows she has to sustain her body with a pork pie and some fruit. But in the end, she can't resist the lure of culture after the practical purpose of a purchase of a tea cloth, and even that's decorated with a picture of King's College Chapel. She can't resist buying a second-hand volume of Keats, which she notes is printed on India paper, a kind of thin but tough paper in use from around 1875. How come she knows that? She's educated, is our Cordelia. She also buys a cotton caftan in greens, blues and browns, a very cheap item of clothing, which comes in handy, as it turns out, but then she'd already been wearing the wrong clothes at a dinner party the previous night. What's important is that it's her purchases that define her. She aspires to, is already well versed in, a decidedly established middle-class culture of consumption, and her consumption of those cultural signs also declare to others that she is middle class. And this has proved how easily and quickly she integrates into the Tilling circle. I'm quite often surprised by how students don't pick up quite how very upper middle class the Tillings are, how very much they are part of the elite. Not only are they students at Cambridge, but they have a father who thinks he's powerful enough to call off the police at the end. A grandmother who's left them enough money not only to buy a very decent house in an up-and-coming area in Cambridge, thank you very much, but also to lay down wine in order to ensure a happy middle age. Now, if those aren't signs of wealth and privilege, I really don't know what are. Yet Cordelia, despite her lack of money, fits in perfectly with them. They like her, and she is indeed seduced by them, and almost lulled by their friendship into calling off the investigation. How can we explain this? Think about Cordelia's father, the itinerant Marxist poet and amateur revolutionary, as she tells Miss Leeming. Cordelia's lived an itinerant life all over Europe, at least after she left school. Her father had died in Rome the previous year. Although the term isn't used in the novel, her father may well have been a variant of what the media called a beatnik, a countercultural, anti-materialistic, but profoundly middle-class movement. Now, I don't want to press this connection, as the beatniks were not communist, while Cordelia's father might well have been. But I did want an excuse to show this picture, in which I can imagine Cordelia's parents. There are two things to point out at it. First, that these poets, musicians, revolutionaries, whether Marxist or beat, ensured that it was men who remained in charge. They were countercultural, that prioritized men's use of women. Sexual liberation and liberation in general was really for men only. And we can certainly see that in Cordelia's father's treatment of her. And here how the woman sits aside while the men are in charge of the cultural production of the music. Second, it's clear that the people in the photograph are subsections of the middle class. They're not interested in money, but they are interested in asserting themselves culturally. What James has done with her formidable eye and pen is understand how the middle class is not monolithic. That's very unlike the Golden Age. The middle class for James has a huge variety of subsections, which she often indicates by a change of location. The Marklands in their horrible, ill-proportioned, bookless room, I quote, are as much a part of the middle class as is the, I quote, establishment scientist Ronald Callender with his Georgian mansion outside Cambridge, with its panelled hall, its carved stone fireplace, its perfume of rose and lavender, and book-lined rooms. Cordelia and Burney belong to the middle class too, though Burney one suspects rather less easily than Cordelia. This careful delineation of the multiple parts of the middle class, therefore, most definitely places Cordelia amongst the middle classes. If then, I've been suggesting money doesn't make class on its own, how can we conceive of class? Well, I've defined it previously in this video as the consumption of certain cultural artifacts as belonging to certain market segments. Certainly that is true from the perspective of the culture industries. The culture industries care about marketing cultural products to the right segments, but we can also think of class in a related but not identical way. A way that James may well not have come across herself, though I have to admit I don't know, but which she seems very well aware of indeed. I'm talking about the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and his notion that society operates according to four basic capitals: the financial, the social, the cultural, and the symbolic. All of these capitals are convertible into another. So you can convert cultural capital into, say, money. Now, I could very happily give a whole lecture on Bourdieu and the four capitals. In fact, there are other capitals that have been added since its original formulation of this notion in the 1960s. But I shan't do so here. There's only a very potted explanation. I'll start with financial capital, and that's very obviously money in some way. I don't need to say any more about that. Social capital is the network of friends and contacts you can draw on to get jobs, for example, and in that way make money. See how financial capital can increase. Just think about Archibald Knox and the production, the publication and dissemination of those 10 rules. What kind of society did Knox come from? Who were his friends? Well, cultural capital is what you know. It's all your knowledge, whether it's your knowledge of Hardy or Keats or William Blake or P.D. James, or how to behave at the dinner party of a famous scientist, how to speak to a judge and what to wear in court to look convincing. You can imagine very easily, I think, that our cultural capital can make us money and indeed increase our network, or indeed decide who is going to be in that network and who is not. Your network, of course, can in turn give you cultural capital. Your friends and contacts can educate you in the widest possible sense. Now, these three terms, financial, social, and cultural capitals, are, I think, pretty clear. Students don't normally have a problem understanding them. Symbolic capital is slippery though, because it refers to status, pure and simple. Except status is neither pure nor simple, for it depends on what social group we find ourselves in. What constitutes high status or low status in one social group may be the opposite in another. For example, my wife won't care if I eat spaghetti with a fork and spoon, but amongst Italian contacts it would be bad form. My family wouldn't care if I stuck my chopsticks in my bowl of rice, but it would be a terrible thing to do in Japan. Any capital, any symbolic capital that I might have had previously, any status, would evaporate instantly by this low status or ignorant behavior. Usually, though symbolic capital is ascribed according to the dominant beliefs of a large social group rather than the small-scale interactions I described in my examples. We can say that reading Hardy and Keats in 1972, which is a demonstration of cultural capital, is also a claim on symbolic capital. It had more status, more symbolic capital than not reading at all. Now, what P.D. James' social realism comprises is understanding this system of signs and understanding how Friend's cultural capital, symbolic capital, and financial capital are interrelated. She shows how, at least in the 1960s and 70s, one can be middle class without a great deal of money. Cordelia has no money, but she has all the cultural trappings of a well-educated young white woman. It's her cultural capital and the symbolic capital that accrues from that cultural capital that enables her to be accepted by the Tillings, and indeed by Miss Leeming and Miss Markland. It's what enables Cordelia to lie convincingly in court. But without money, Cordelia is not entirely secure as a member of the middle class. She may be within it culturally, but she's also outside it. She's not going to be able to buy a house or lay down wine, is she? Her being inside and outside at the same time, her being on the margin, gives her what Bourdieu called a special lucidity. Bourdieu claimed that the marginal see more and see better than either those safely inside a group or those entirely outside it. Cordelia sees with a terrible clarity how society works, and she's able to manipulate it accordingly. Now, I do want to stress something that, in my experience, students sometimes don't understand. Marginalized is not the same as excluded. If someone or something is on the margins, they are both inside and out at the same time. And that in turn means that they're neither inside nor outside. They are distanced from both the outside and the inside. That distance means that they can compare and contrast both and see accordingly. As you can imagine, this position, this marginal position, is very, very different from Golden Age tropes. This raises several questions regarding Cordelia. Is the marginal middle class, and does she hate being marginal? Would she prefer to belong to the powerful middle class or be completely outside it? Maybe she wants just to belong at all, just to form an alliance with someone. Perhaps that someone might be marginalized like her. Perhaps she doesn't want to be allied with someone inside or outside, but someone marginalized. Perhaps a neglected child like her. Perhaps a mother who's taken revenge on a manipulative father. If so, this suggests a psychological disturbance on the part of Cordelia and therefore of the detective, and hence another difference from Golden Age commonplaces. Cordelia is indeed in an uncomfortable marginal position in terms of class, but also in terms of gender and sexuality. After all, we're told repeatedly that her job is not a suitable job for a woman. There are attempts to exclude her, but she's not entirely integrated either. The narrative is almost exclusively from her perspective. It may be third-person omniscient, but she is the powerful focalizer until the sudden appearance of Adam Dalgliesh at the end, like a deus ex machina, that term from Greek tragedy that we heard in the video on Raymond Chandler and Form, the deus ex machina. For most of the novel, though, Cordelia mediates experience for us. We follow her thoughts. We find that early on, her childhood is very close to her, very close to the thinking voice, which is not quite the voice, it's not quite the narrating voice, but it's the focalizer's voice. When she touches Bernie's hair after his suicide, she reacts with, "This was how Daddy had felt." Her childhood is constantly near the surface and threatening to erupt. As the novel progresses, we find out more and more about that childhood. The novel is not just an investigation of the crime, but also an investigation of the detective. We find out about her father's appalling neglect and utterly selfish use of her as nursemaid and messenger. We also start to uncover Cordelia's profound sexual perversity. Of course she's in love with the dead man, with dead Mark. He is to her what the lady is to the knight. She serves him. She's on a quest to find out who he really is, and since she can't rescue him, to avenge him. And in finding out who he really is, she finds out who she is. For she is him. Her love is a profoundly narcissistic love. It's a love that seeks to heal her own wounds through him. She's avenging herself through him, as we discover. She's using him just as she had been used, as an empty vehicle for her own needs. Of course, she cross-dresses in her beloved's clothes. Of course, she winds one around Mark's pullovers around Isabel's neck. A horrible scene when I think about it. And most importantly, there's her wearing of Mark's long leather belt. It's a wonder stroke that it's her perversity in wearing the clothes of a dead man that she's in love with that saves Cordelia from death when Lunn throws her down the well. Cordelia certainly does suffer mentally. Cordelia is mad in many ways. But she survives. The trope of the criminal as deviant is already starting to look rather ragged, isn't it? And we do have to ask, of course, who is the criminal? Well, Daddy Calendar, obviously, because he killed his son, but also because he participated in the fraud against his father-in-law that his wife colluded with. But then Lunn tried to kill Cordelia, Miss Leeming participated in the fraud against her employer's father-in-law, and then she killed Sir Ronald. Then there's Hugo and Sophia, along with Isabel, who all pervert the course of justice by tampering with evidence and lying, or at least withholding evidence. Then there's Cordelia. She obviously aids and abets a murderer and perjures herself in court. And then what of the sainted Mark? Why couldn't he just have been a sensible boy and handed over the money to his father if he wasn't interested in it, so that his father could continue his very important microbiological conservation work that would benefit the world? What would you do in the circumstances? Well, I'd just hand over the money if I wasn't interested. Marx's narrow scale of values wouldn't allow that, though. Obviously, most of these criminals are distinctly inside middle-class society and either contribute to its well-being or they will contribute soon, so we assume. Two, though, are marginal, but they are no better. Everyone has something to hide. Everyone is criminal. And that certainly seems the case here. If these are representatives of society, then it seems society itself is to blame, a very un-golden age attitude, at least as most critics see it. And some of you know, listening to this, I'm not so sure myself. But what it does do is raise the big question that's emerged so often in this series of videos, which is a huge one. What is the relation of law to justice? What the law is clear in An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. But justice? Oh, I'm not at all sure I know. But the text makes me feel that it's important to debate it. At this point, An Unsuitable Job for a Woman doesn't seem quite so golden age, does it? It seems more cynical, more hard-boiled, perhaps. The characters try to do the right thing in An Unsuitable Job for a Woman, but they all fail. And that's quite typical for P.D. James. And Louise Harrison says that P.D. James's tragic outlook and criticism of society stems from her conservative Anglican perspective. Don't forget P.D. James's position in the House of Lords as a conservative peer. But I think that what P.D. James has written in An Unsuitable Job for a Woman is much more ambiguous, much more open. Sure, if we look at the novel from the novelist's point of view, as so many critics have tried to do, we will understand that James is writing from a conservative Anglican perspective. But from the reader's perspective, and that's what this course and this series of videos is about, P.D. James's novels as a whole must be more ambiguous than simply reflecting a conservative Anglican point of view, simply because they sell so much and so widely, far beyond conservative Anglican readership. We need to think of alternative parameters of meaning that are open to us. To me, and this has arisen as a result of many conversations with students over the years, one of the reasons so many of us like An Unsuitable Job for a Woman is not that it's tied to the Golden Age or to some notion of conservative Anglicanism or any fixed position that's clearly inside one social or textual grouping, but because it's so ambiguous, so on the margins. If we get away from ideas of trying to establish what the author intended or how the author and text were marketed and how they seek to lock down meanings for us, perhaps we can read the novel as a narrative all about marginality, about being simultaneously inside and outside. And that marginality can open and remind us of the special lucidity of the marginal. It can ask us to think about that. It can ask us to think about what it means for us to exist in society or on the margins of it, to reflect on what the parameters of meaning are that we're willing to engage with to interpret the world. It can ask us to consider who we are, what our values are, and what the value of what we do might be. Do we want to be tied into or defined by one market segment without thinking about it? Maybe it's worth trying to stay on the margins, even if it is uncomfortable, because then we can see more acutely and more broadly. It's possible to raise all these fundamental questions by reading any text suspiciously. But precisely because an unsuitable job for a woman is so disturbing, at least for me, it opens the door to reflection of who we are and who we want to be. In case you were wondering at this video's colour scheme, of course it was partly inspired by the novel's Debt to the Golden Age, but we can't forget 1970s fashion either, whose autumnal colours were a reaction to the brightness of the 1960s psychedelic palette. Now, some of you have written to ask me about the music that I've been using on this series. Now, as always, each fragment is based on one simple 4-note motif, originally an A, B flat, G and F sharp, and this one's no exception. Well, you'll have noted the significance of religious places and choirs in the novel, and I've tried to be inspired by that sound. You'll remember the convent school run by nuns and the Sunday afternoon evensong in King's College Chapel, which are all significant settings. The music begins and ends with a persistent and solitary C, the tiniest fragment of religious plain chant, as the 4-note motif is gradually made to sound simultaneously in multiple transpositions. The C at the end lasts beyond Burney's B on the one side and the D for Dalgleish on the other. Cordelia survives, as does class, whether we like it or not.